The Adventures of Tom Sawyer by Mark Twain. Longman Simplified English Series. Read by Surya Thongmak. Chapter 12. What Tom Overheard. A few minutes later, Tom was in the shallow water of the sandbar, stepping towards the Illinois bank. Before the water reached his waist, he was halfway over. Then he began confidently to swim the remaining 100 yards. He reached the bank, pulled himself out, and set out in his streaming garments through the woods. A little before 10 o'clock, he came out into an open space opposite the village, and saw the ferryboat laying by the high bank. He tripped down, slipped into the water, swam a few yards, and climbed into the rolling boat fastened to the ferryboat. He lay down and waited. Soon the bell rang. A voice gave the order to cast off, and the voyage began. Tom was pleased at his success, for he knew that it was the boat's last trip for the night. A quarter of an hour later, the engine stopped. Tom slipped overboard and swam ashore, landing 50 yards downstream, where there was less danger of being seen. He flew along deserted lands, and soon found himself at his aunt's back fence. He climbed over and approached the window of Aunt Polly's room, for a light was burning there. That said Aunt Polly, Sid, Mary, and Joe Hubbard's mother, grouped together talking. They were by the bed, and the bed was between them and the door. Very slowly Tom pressed open the door, trembling every time it creaked. When he just that he might creep through on hands and knees, he put his head through and began. He wasn't bad, only mischievous. He never meant to do any harm, and he was the best-hearted boy that ever lived. She began to cry. My Joe was the same. He was full of monkey tricks, but always unselfish and kind. I whipped him for taking that dream, forgetting that I threw out myself because it was sore. It was heartbreaking to think that I'll never see him again in this world. Never, never, never. Poor, ill-treated boy. Mr. Harper wept bitterly. I hope Tom is happier where he is, says it. But if he'd been better in some ways, Sid, Tom knew that the old lady's eyes flashed all through, although he could not see them. Don't say a word against my Tom now that he's dead. Oh, Mr. Harper, I don't know how to give him up. I don't know how to give him up. God gives and God takes away, but it's so hard. Oh, it's so hard. Only last Saturday, my Joe made me jump with one of his noisy tricks, and I struck him. If he could do it again, I'll take him in my arms and bless him for it. Yes, yes, I know. Just how you feel. Mr. Harper, only yesterday my Tom filled the cat full of painkiller, and I did think that the creature would tear the house down. And God forgive me, I slapped him. Poor boy, poor dead boy, but he's out of his troubles now. And the last words I ever heard him say were to blame me. But this memory was too much for the old lady, and she broke down entirely. Tom was crying now, and more in pity of himself than of anybody else. He could hear Mary crying and putting in a kindly word for him. From time to time, still he was sufficiently moved by his aunt's grief too long to rush out and overcome her with the joy of his return. But he resisted the temptation. He went on listening and gathered that it was thought at first that the boys had been drowned while having a swim. Then a small raft had been missed. Next, it was remembered that the missing boys had promised that the village would hear something starting soon. The opinion of most people was the boys had gone off on the raft and would appear at the next town downstream. But at noon, The raft had been found against the bank 5 or 6 miles below the village. They must be drowned, otherwise hunger would have driven them home. This was Wednesday night. If the boys continued to be missing, and if their bodies were not recovered from the river before Sunday, all hope would be given up and funeral service would be held on Sunday morning. Tom chuckled. Mr. Harper wiped his eyes, said good night and left, and Polly was far more tender than usual in her good night to Sid and Mary, who went off crying. And Polly knelt down and prayed for Tom so earnestly, and with such infinite love in her words and her old trembling voice, that Tom's eyes were streaming with tears long before she had finished. He had to keep still long after she had gone to bed, for she was restless and kept on murmuring broken-heartedly, but at last she lay still, only mourning a little in her sleep. Now the boy stole out and stood regarding her. His heart was full of pity for her. He took out the bark roll and placed it by the candle. But something occurred to him, and he stood considering. A smile lit up his face, and he put the bark back in his pocket. Then he bent over and kissed the faded lips and tiptoed out. He went to the ferry landing and walked boldly on board the boat, for he knew that the watchman always slept like a log. He untied the rowing boat, slipped into it, and was soon rowing consciously across the river. He was tempted to capture it, but he knew that a thorough search would be made for it, and then they might be discovered, so he tied it up as soon as he landed and set off through the woods. It was broad daylight before he found himself opposite the island sandbar. He rested until the sun was well up on turning the surface of the great river into gold, and then entered the water. A little later, he paused, dripping, on the edge of the camp. "No, Tom, he's drowned," he heard Joe say, "and he'll come back. He won't desert. He knows that it would be shameful for a pirate, and Tom's too proud for that sort of thing. But I wonder what he's doing." "Well, the things are ours, aren't there?" "Nearly, but not quite. Huck, the writing says, and there are if he's not back for breakfast, which he is," exclaimed Tom, stepping grandly into camp. A splendid breakfast was soon provided, and Tom described his adventures. They were a vain and blissful company of heroes. When the tale was finished, then Tom hid himself away to sleep till noon, and the other pirates got ready to fish and explore.